Bu Alis, link YouTube aku share di chat ya untuk Bu Alis share ke mahasiswanya.
Terima kasih ya, Bu. Saya cek dulu.
Bu Alis, kita bisa mulai mungkin.
Ya, bisa. Bisa. Boleh ya?
Bu Narisa mungkin bisa dimulai.
Ya, oke. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dan selamat pagi semuanya. Terima kasih teman-teman sudah hadir di dalam workshop internasional yang Universitas Negeri Makasar berkolaborasi dengan Universitas UTM di Malaysia dan universitas lainnya. Hari ini adalah hari pertama dalam workshop kita dengan tema desain proses. Jadi ini adalah desain proses pertama, dan pembicara kita atau yang akan memberikan kita materi, kita bisa diskusi bersama dan berbincang mendapatkan ilmu, yaitu adalah Ibu Profesor Dr. Alice Sabrina Ismail dari Departemen Arsitektur UTM University Teknologi Malaysia. Bisa saja saya langsung memberikan kepada beliau untuk memberikan dan menjelaskan. Terima kasih. Saya akan berikan kepada Ibu.
Okey. Terima kasih ya. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Suara saya kedengaran ya? Jelas ya?
Ya.
Lancar ya?
Ya.
Okay. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, please allow me to speak today. For today's lecture is actually in English because we'll be having some international students from UTM also to join in for this international workshop. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to say thank you so much to Universitas Negeri Makasar actually for inviting me for this morning session for the international workshop design process, especially to my dear colleague, Dr. Ibu Andi Abida, who is actually the head program of architecture, who runs the architecture program in Universitas Negeri Makasar, and also to all the team from Universitas Negeri Makasar. Thank you so much for your invitation to me as a speaker for this morning. All right. Without further ado, I will share my screen on the slides for this morning's presentation. Okay, so I hope it's clear. Is it clear? Everyone can see my slide?
The slide is nice.
Okay, so I'll put it in the slideshow mode so everyone can actually view my slide. Okay, so basically my talk today is about pedagogy of design process and thinking. We'll be looking at the way forward in terms of how do we design things. And when we relate things with the built environment, especially in the architecture world, not only architecture, but all of those things that relate with design, not only talking about architecture, we're talking about interior design, we're talking about arts and design and things like that. It's all need to have a process. And when there is a process, there's always relate to the word thinking to it. So meaning like thinking in looking into things critically and looking into things how you justify your thinking in actually producing some positive outcome, especially for the benefit of the user. So that is only the snippets of my talk today. And we'll be looking also in the sense of proposition. How do we actually bring the idea of design process and thinking into formulating some new outcome that actually not only benefit to the user, but also can contribute to the development of the society. All right. So this is me. Just a quick recap. My name is Associate Professor Dr. Alice. I'm actually teaching at the architecture program for almost like 13 to 15 years now. And on the other hand also, I'm actually the founder and director of a research center, which is actually parked under the Perbadanan Museum Negeri Melaka, the Melaka Museum Corporation, which is known as the Research Center of Conservation for Sustainable Ethnic Heritage. So for those of you who wants to know more about me, you can just scan my QR code and you can get my CV and my details and also my research projects, activities and publication that I have done under the research center, and also part of my task as an lecturer in the architecture program in University Technology Malaysia. So just a quick one to introduce to everyone. This is the research center that I'm attaching to, which is known as CASE. And under CASE, we look a lot about, we actually discuss a lot about ethnicity. And we look on how ethnicity and culture actually can relate with each other. And in terms of related with the built environment, and also looking into preservation, conservation, and also looking into the new ways of talking about hybridity and also adaptation. So in this sense, when we talk about ethnicity and also culture, it really relates a lot with the topic that we're going to discuss this morning, is talking about designing for people and designing for the user and also designing for the community. So for those who wants to know more about my research center that I'm attaching to under the Perbadanan Museum Negeri Melaka, please scan the QR code, and then you can get access to the website, and also you can get access to all the activities that we've done in CASE, which is in the research center. All right, so before we move on further, I won't go very detailed in terms of explaining the design process, looking into theoretical manner, because it's going to be a very boring talk if we talks about theoretical implementation and theoretical approach. But if we look into the design process into the philosophical point of view, then we'll be looking into something which is more solid and which is more on the ground and which is more interesting for all of you to understand that design process is not only producing product and outcome, but it is a huge process that relates to a lot of different things that actually contribute not only to society, not only in the short term, but also in the long-term effect. So before I move on into that, I would like to share you this picture. So this picture, if you can see on the left-hand side, is actually a traditional house. And on your left-hand side is actually a modern housing, which is a modern terrace housing. But if you look at this traditional house was not built and it was not designed actually by a professional architect who actually graduated with a degree or with a certificate from a very structured kind of an education or from a university. Because traditional houses was designed actually by craftsmen. And craftsmen are what we call as tukang ukir or tukang bena in the Malay language or in the Indonesian language, was that the knowledge was transferred through the process known as oral tradition. So the design process that is learned by this craftsman is actually from what you call that, from generation to generation, where it is not inherited through books or through writings or through structured and formal education, but it's just only through oral education from one tukang ukir, from one craftsman, which is known as the master builder, what we known as mentor, to the what you known as the student, or what we call it in a term process of an oral tradition process. So, but if you can see the beauty of traditional houses compared to the modern houses, it is very, very different and it's very unique. Because traditional houses was built through a process and a design process known as the genius loci, where the houses was built and originated from the local context, from the daily life, the customs, or what we know as the adat resam in Bahasa Melayu or Bahasa Indonesia, adat resam, the daily lives, the daily activities, and the daily living of the people. And this is what makes the design process beautiful. because the design process go through a different phases of evolution in that sense, and through go a different phases of what we call known as living quality, not looking into quantity and not looking into money oriented. But this is different. If you look into modern houses was built by professional architects, by professional developers, by people who has gone through a structured formal education system. But the way how modern houses was built, all of these values, the design values, the design process, all of it are gone because it gone through a very process known as what we called quickly built manufactured identity, and what we known as quick kind of production, or what we known as mass production. So in this sense, the idea of the design process gone through a different kind of a stage where they talk about mass production, where they talk about money oriented compared to the traditional houses. But as you can see, if you're looking at the design of the traditional houses, even though it looks old, it looks antique, it looks like an artifact, you know, it builds from wood, from timber. It uses these what you call that, coconut leaves for the known as nipa for the roof structure. But the beauty and the tradition of the traditional houses, the identity, it's still unique and it still stands. Okay, so this is the thing that when we go through a design process, you know, a design process is not about the end outcome. It's not about you getting in terms of talking about regenerating of economy, or talking about more about values of money or materialistic value, but it's about the value of the people and the value of the culture. So this is the problem when we talk about modernization comes into place, and it affects in terms of technology, in terms of modernization into the design process. And as you can see, a lot of our modern houses has problem in terms of the design. I think Indonesia also facing the same thing, and most of well-developed countries like in Indonesia, in China, we talk about modern houses that lost in terms of its identity because it was built in a mass production, in kind of an ad hoc renovation. And in that sense, it loses the sense of talking about thermal comfort. The users and users feeling of comfort in terms of feeling of what you call that, sense of basic design principles of a really basic housing, talking about fulfilling the daily and necessities life in that sense. And I talk about this issue a lot. Actually, in the BFM radio, I was called one of the speaker in the BFM radio, where I discusses about housing design and also development in Malaysia, and looking into what is the problem of modern houses compared to the traditional houses. Because like what I explained earlier, traditional houses went through a very unique design process where it talks about humanity, values at each phases of development of houses, compared to modern houses where they only talk about mass production, and it talks about income generation, and it talks about economies, talking about making what you call that, wealth and also benefits to a certain people like developers and things like that. So for those who want to know more about housing design, and you can look into the case study in Malaysia, you can scan the QR code and listen to my podcast in the BFM radio. Okay, so another issue that I would like to highlight, because I want to highlight a lot about building typologies that happens around us. So I will just only pick the most common building typologies that actually showcasing to us what is the problem if that we don't have a clear design process, especially we as an architect, when we design the product or an outcome, especially the built environment or the building for the people and for the society. And another example that I would like to show you is about the elderly housing. And just now I show you is about the modern kind of a living typical houses, which is for the society, but which for the mass people, for the mass populace. And now we are focusing about the issue about elderly housing. And if you look at throughout all the world, that by the year 2040, most of the countries, especially the well-developed countries like India, you have Japan, you have China, you have Malaysia, and also including Indonesia, by the year 2040, will be arriving to a stage known as the aging society. So, but if you look into the context of Malaysia, by the year 2040, Malaysia will have an estimation of 11 million elderly people aged 65 years and above. So this is quite an alarming issue. And not only that, when we talk about the issue of aging society, we need to look back at our context. Does the country that we live in provide enough facilities to support this elderly living? And where in Malaysia, where I live, where I come from, we don't have enough support in terms of healthcare facilities and also in terms of the elderly housing. And this is a very, very what we know as a nation issue that need to be quickly addressed. And China is also facing this problem in that sense. So if you look at the calculation that I've done research previously in year 2022, Malaysia has an estimation of 3 million elderly people. So the number is 3 million. But in total, in the year 2022, what is quite an alarming situation was that Malaysia only has about 2,066 elderly care centers or to cater for the elderly people. And these elderly care centers is actually looking into the government, the NGOs, and the private. So can we actually fulfill the needs of 3 million people elderly living of the age of 65 within the number of 2,066 total housing that is provided for the elderly in Malaysia? So the big question here is that where do the remaining of these elderly live and seek shelter? So this is quite an issue, and it also involved the idea of talking about design process. Because if you look into the current condition of elderly care center in Malaysia, what I'm taking example is what happening in my country, is that we still have a problem in terms of designing the layout of our elderly care center. Because why? Because there is no sense of cultural values. There is no sense of what you call the empathy in terms of design. And when we talk about this design, the idea always comes up from what we know as top-down approach. And I think Indonesia is also facing the same situation, right? If you have what you call that, an architecture project, is usually the politician or what we call the top management handle in terms of the management project. And all decision always goes back to the government rather than it comes out from the bottom-up approach, which is from the society or from the mass populace. So this is what happening also in all the nation of what we know as well-developed countries. So if you look into the Malaysian situation, I'm taking examples here so that you can have an overview why design process is important. So if you see that this elderly care center in Malaysia, it lacks in terms of deficiency of the physical design setting. You don't have enough what you call that personal spaces for the elderly design, and there is lack in terms of the senior cultural values in terms of the design of the layout of the housing. And the most alarming situation also, this is one of the example of the elderly houses that was built in Malaysia, a newly one built in 2020. And it was it was managed by the government, which is under the government, Malaysian government. And as you can see, the design of the elderly housing, I'm not saying that the design is bad, but in terms of maybe in terms of the design wise, it really fulfills certain needs of certain management people. But in terms of how the way they design, it doesn't really look into the elderly cultural values. Because you can see when you design for elderly people, you cannot have a high rise or what we call as a low rise design building. Every of the design should be within one floor because it's quite hard for the elderlies to move around. And when you design in terms of segregating the spaces or the zoning rather than to cluster them together in a centralized planning, it really have a problem in terms of circulation and in terms of accessibility, especially when we talk about the elderly people are disabled, where they are on wheelchair, where they have a problem in terms of walking, in terms of wayfinding and things like that. But this is the problem and the scenario when we talk about when you approach design in not a fruitful manner. When you approach your design process looking into more top-down approach rather than a bottom-up approach. And this is the end product that you get for the society. So if you can see, if this is what's happening, the scenario in your country, or especially in Malaysia, in my own country, the building that you built will stand forever unless somebody goes and bomb the building and it destroys the building. So, but when you call about the built environment or architecture or a building, it is an edifice. So means like if it's an edifice, if you build something, it will stand forever, maybe 20 years, 30 years down the road in a long-term kind of a projection. So at the end of the day, the community will suffer in that sense if we as an architect doesn't go through a proper design process. Okay, so for those of you who wants to know more about the issue of the elderly, you can also scan my podcast. I'm talking about this issue about designing cities for elderly. I'm not looking at examples of modern cities in the world, looking into cities in the well-developed nation like Malaysia, Indonesia, and also like in other countries and in India. And we're looking at how actually we're going to design a better cities for the elderly. And this is what we call about inside this podcast also. I'm talking about the design principles and the design process of looking at how we design buildings, the built environment for the elderly in that sense, for those of you who wants to know more. Okay, another issue that I would like to bring forth this morning as an eye-opener to all is talking about schools. Every one of us goes to school. I mean, you went to secondary schools, you went to primary schools, you went to high school, and you go finally to university. And when we talk about schools design, this is the most common typologies because all of us goes to school. The basic school design, what I'm come from when I come from Malaysia, is that schools are designed in a very formal kind of a planning layout. Because why I'm saying is that school is important because school is where the basic education where student gets before they move on to become human, where they become matured elders or they become matured people in society. Because school is the basic foreground that actually teaches you about life. But if you look at how most of schools are designed in the context of my country itself, it's very, very what you call that rigid in terms of exploration. So in that sense, schools limits in terms of students' creativity, in terms of student growth, in terms of student exposures to the community and to the society. Because when schools are designed in what you call that in rigid manner, like you can see, if you read my paper, I talk about learning spaces in public secondary schools, where I did a research on few designs of compilations of schools in Malaysia, and all of them look the same. Whether you are in the northern states, the middle states, or in the southern states, all of the schools are what you call that design in a very rigid form manner that is a prototyping modular that is being repeated all around Malaysia. So this is the problem scenario that when you have this kind of schools, the problem of how you design the corridor ways, how you design your classroom, how you design the way how actually student moves and circulate within the spaces, this actually gives an impact to the student psychology and development well-being. So at the end of the day, the school that we provide for students, I'm talking about my own country as an example, is that we are producing students not to think creatively as human. We are producing them as factory workers, or what you call, what I prefer it to call like robots, you know, like you work in factories, because the school are designed like factories, like mass production and things like that. So this is the problem when we talk about poor design quality. And poor design quality always relate back to design process in that sense. So as an overall, when you look at all the samples or the examples that I give you, that is three typologies. We look into the mass housing that we live in, the elderly housing that we look into, the schools that we are actually getting our education since our early childhood. So why do we live in this kind of a living condition? So this is back to us, especially we as an architect, we as a designer of the built environment. Is it that we don't have this sense and lack of humanistic and cultural values? Is it that we are being ignorant or versus awareness? Or is it that we don't even care about the standard of living versus the quality of life because we are too engrossed or we are too embossed with talking about economy development, or we are talking about making profits in certain projects and things like that? Or is it because of the policies maker? Is it because of the government policy, the politician who actually sets the rules and regulations, who sets the projects to us in that sense, or who actually make the guidelines and the policies? But at the end of the day, if we look into all of these issues that is being brought to us, it looks back into us, into our role and responsibility of designer. Because I think I'm talking to the room here full of academicians who are actually from the built environment. I'm talking to students who are going to become future architects. I'm talking to my postgraduate students, to all postgraduate students who will become future researchers of the country, not only in Malaysia, in China, in Indonesia, and also part of the world. So what is our role and responsibility? Because this is the thing that we have to face every day in our society. So design is very important, because if you come up with a very bad design quality, it will stay forever. Okay, so that's back to the issue that I'm going to talk about today. Why design? Why is design so important? So this is what I like to take from Robert L. Peters, because Robert L. Peters is talking about design creates culture, and every human living in the world have their own culture. Indonesian culture, Malay culture, Chinese culture, Indian culture, wherever ethnicity or minority or majorities that you come from, you always have your own culture. And design creates your own culture. And culture shapes values. And this is what is the most important thing. We talk about nilai, nilai kemanusiaan. This is what we know as humanity values. And values actually determine the future, who you are, who you're going to be, your future generation, your son, your future grandson, granddaughters, and things like that. They're going to live in a built environment. But if your built environment is mundane, your built environment is actually restricting you on how you to live, and how you to move, on how you to think as a human, it will actually limits you to become a human. And at the end of the day, you will just have a society that will work as a robot. You know, talking about production, talking about mass, talking about profit making and things like that. So I would like to pick up one of the quotation by Tim Brown, who is the CEO of IDEO. Later, I will explain what is IDEO all about, IDEO. So what Tim Brown was saying was that design actually can help improve our lives in the present. And also design thinking can help us chart the future. So in this sense, design is very important. It's not only talking about the short term that we live in now within the context of 5 years to 10 years, but it will talk about the long duration, about the future, what's going to be next. For instance, if you see like Steve Jobs is actually talking about handphone, mobile phone, iPhone, and things like that. 40, 50, 60 years down the road, we don't have iPhone. Okay, we don't have podcast. We don't have iPods and things like that. But now, when all of this design and technology comes into place, it comes and improve the quality of life in the present. So this is actually benefit to the user and to the community. So I would like to take such a quick example. Most of us here are an architect. We have a design background, and most of you are from the built environment niche areas or expertise. If you see this picture, this is actually a house designed by Tadao Ando, and it's known as the row house. When Tadao Ando, is a Japanese architect, comes into the design of the row house, he designed a modern house. You know, a modern house like a mess house, that the one that I show you, a terrace house like in Malaysia. But the beauty part of this terrace house designed by Tadao Ando is that it adopts and implied the idea of a traditional Japanese house. If you look here, Reka Bentuk Classic, this is a traditional Japanese house that where it talks about anthropometrics, where it talks about size and scale based on the tatami mat. And when we go to the Japanese culture, Japanese always highly value this idea of humanity to it. And that's why when you see to the traditional Japanese house, they always talk about proportion. They always talk about scale. Because when you design a building with scale, with proportion, it will always bring back the feeling of comfort. You always bring back the feeling of unity within the family, or the boundary, what you call that bonding of relationship between the family, or what we call known as ukuah. Okay, ukuah means the feeling of community living. And Japanese always believe in this idea of talking about ukuah and community in whatever building that they design. That's why when you see the Japanese traditional houses. If you watch anime movies like Suzume, you know, that's the most famous one, and Demon Slayer, okay, one example, and also a lot of Japanese anime in terms of the cartoon character like Whispered Away and things like that. They always shown these showcases of traditional Japanese houses designed within the what you call that, the looking into the anthropometrics and the size of scale, because size and scale will always give an impact, talking about comfort, talking about ukua, community values, and things like that. And Tadao Ando bring that elements into the row house, which is the modern housing design. And the housing design of the modern house designed by Tadao Ando is a very simple kind of a basic house. It's very long in rectangle. But the way the design in terms of the hierarchy, in terms of the zoning, in terms of the circulation, in terms of the size and anthropometrics, it really reflects what's happening in the traditional Japanese house. So this what brings that when we talk about design, it doesn't mean that you forget your past, because design will always start from history, the past that you bring to the present, that you bring to the future. And that is what makes the key design process is important. Okay, another example that I would like to show you. Okay, this is a house, a vertical housing living in Singapore. It was designed by an architect known as Chang Jun Fen. And this building project is known as the Bedok Court Condominium. So for those who have been to Singapore, it's a good case study for you to visit, because Bedok Court Condominium, designed by architect Cheng Jun Fen, it looks back looking into bringing the traditional Malay house into vertical living, which means that even though you live vertically, the idea of community bonding, the idea of unification, the idea of relationship, the idea of anthropometrics and size can comes into place whenever you design, even though you go vertical, or not only can go horizontal in that sense. So as you can see in this diagram, the way that how Cheong Jun Fen interpret the idea of a traditional Malay house planning layout into a modern house, where he still maintain the zoning of the traditional house. Like you have the veranda, like you have the middle house, which is known as the rumah ibu. Okay, the middle house, the rumah tengah, and also the kitchen, which is the rumah dapur. And as you know, when you talk about traditional house, and also, I know that all of you are Bugis people, and Bugis people is very strong in terms of the house design. Am I right, Ibu Andi? Because Bugis people always talk about female domain in the house of the Bugis people. And rumah dapur, which is the kitchen, is always an important part that plays the role in the culture of the Bugis people, where Bugis people always talk about feminism, we talk about women in terms of the society and in terms of the culture. And there is a known of the adat that they always hold on. I can't remember what is the name. I was in Makasar before, and I talk about this this adat of the Bugis people known as, maybe Ibu Andi need to help me on this one. Is something with not pinisi is perahu. There's a word to it. I can't remember, but it's called the Adat Resam of Bugis. Maybe once I remember after this in Q&A, I will bring that thing up. So this is where when we adopt into modern houses. So when Chen Junfu designed this, he looks about all this replication, talking about adaptation and hybridity in terms of the design layout. So they still maintain the veranda, they still maintain the middle house, the rumah ibu, according to the custom, according to the zoning and spaces. And I can see you some of very nice photos in Bedok condominium, even though it goes high rise, but even though it goes in place with hierarchy, but there is a place what we know as community gathering within the spaces, the solid and void. So the feelingness of what we call the kampong feeling or the village feeling or living in a community, it's still there, even though it goes high rise or it goes vertically point of a design in that sense. So when we talk about design, I'm giving you a few examples earlier. Design is not only just talking about simply design something, you know, because design is what I like to repeat back again. Design is what you learn from the past, you bring to the present, and also you bring it to the future. So what is basically design all about? So if you look into the terminology and the meaning of design, design is a discipline of study. It is a practice that focuses the interaction between a person, a user, with the man-made environment. And when we talk about the man-made environment, it needs to take into account the idea of functionality, contextuality, cultural, and societal consideration. So in this sense, when we talk about design, it has to fulfill a level of social cultural aspects in terms from the personal level, the family level, the society level. It goes up to the cultural level. And cultural level, we talk about the idea of macro context that includes the history, the language, the religion, the tradition, the customs, the way how people live within the big society. And then only it will develop into the identity level. Because if design doesn't fulfill all these categories, we will produce a design without identity. And when we have a product without identity, there's no sense of belonging to it. So this is what we talk about, the problem of modernism comes into place. You remember the modernism era, the era of Mies van der Rohe, where they talk about producing buildings like a shoebox, you know, like the Seagram buildings. So buildings looks the same everywhere you go. That is the problem with modern movement. And when the modern movement comes in, the building has no sense of identity. Because the idea of identity for each individuality of the building design in terms of the facade, in terms of the outlook, in terms of the styles is not there. So modernity wouldn't stay long because modernity suddenly dies and it comes into the idea of a thinking of regionalism. We talk about deconstructivism comes into place next after modernism and calls about postmodernism, where the era of Charles Jenks, Michael Graves, you know, all of those famous architects talking about symbolism, talking about semiotics into design. So this is the problem. If we as a designer, especially architects, are not aware of this kind of situation. So to me, I like to take that quote by John Haskett, 2005. He's the famous writer of books talking about design. Design is to design a design to produce a design. So design in noun is a general concept. It's also design in terms of verb, which is an action. And there's also a noun, a plan or intention. And the outcome also comes up to design. So design is to design a design to produce a design. So what kind of design? Because if we look at design by Charles Owen, 2004, design is actually a profession because it talks about services, it talks about products, it talks about system, it talks about communication to satisfy the human needs, to improve people's quality life. And in this sense, it has to respect for the welfare of the natural environment. And that's why design is very important. And Harold Nelson and Eric Stocktonman also talks about design is not only designing, because when we design certain things, it's about the ability to imagine, because you also have to have an imagined thinking that which does not yet exist. So now we're talking about designing for the future, designing for the addition to the real world in the future. What is going to be in 20 years down the road, 30 years, 40 years? And how does your design now actually contribute in the future generation? And that is also important. And Harold Nelson also talked about design make change. Design can change society. Design can change the values of the people. For instance, now we look at mobile phone. 20, 30 years ago, we don't have a mobile phone. But now, since Steve Jobs comes out with Apple, you know, it talks about iPhone, it talks about iPods. It changed the society. Now we talk about the new generation is all attached with the mobile phone. You can't live with a mobile phone. And mobile phone actually evolve, and talking about evolution of the society, it changed the mindset. It changed the new generation of thinking. And I'm taking example of ChatGPT now. ChatGPT is changing the world now. Technology of ChatGPT has changed and makes students becomes much more lazier. Researchers become lazier because everything, when you click on the bot, ChatGPT will produce everything for you. So this is what we call the outcome. And if we don't design it properly, we make a difference. Yes, we make a difference, but it is a difference that benefit the society, or it is a difference that actually not giving a good outcome to the society. Because change of evolution is also about design. And change of process is also evolution. And change of difference is also a process. So this is critical when we talk about design, and it is not easy to become a designer. So design is to initiate change in man-made things. We not only talk about the early example, I gave example of buildings because all of us are architects, institutions, urban areas, experiences, social networks. So all of our everyday daily life evolve with design. So if you don't design correctly, we may give the wrong signal to the future, and not only to the current context, but also to the future. So Harold Olson also said that, like Hephaestus, we have to design because we want to survive. Yes, because we have to evolve as human. We cannot stay stagnant. But if we do not find the world in a condition that is satisfying and fully fulfilling to us, design has to bring the sense of enlightenment. You know, it has to bring a certain meaning to our lives. And we know that whenever we design, we cannot perfect it in one go. You know, it has to go through a process of evolution. That's why when you look at the technology of cars, when Henry Ford first actually come up with the car design, the early car design, it looks so antique, it looks so basic, it looks so functional. But now when we talk about BYD, you know, build their own design car by China, we talks about talking in great thing about technology where the car can speaks to you, you know, like Telsa comes into place and things like that. So these are the ideation that we talk about evolution in design. It may be good, it may be bad to society, but we still have to keep designing. And when we talk about design, it talks about imagining things, you know, talking about future, talking about decision making. So all of this requires a long term and not only a short term kind of an imagination. And I like to take this idea also by Brian Lawson, who wrote a book in 2009 about design thinking. He talked about design, which is a mixture of creativity and also analysis. So you cannot produce design without coming with an issue, without doing analyzing, because design is relating to problem solving. And this problem solving is very fundamental to all human activities. And one of the basic questions that maybe I ask you, is design easy? I like to ask this to all of my architecture students. Is it easy to design? Mudah ke nak design? It's difficult. If I give you a project to design an elderly housing, or I give you a project to design a gallery on a site context, is it easy? No, it's not easy. Because if you are an architect, if you are an architect with full of empathy, with full of responsibility, and have this sense of human and cultural values, you will design something that will look into the genius loci. We look into the context. We look at how people believe into things. How and what do people want? And that's what make a good designer. Okay, maybe later at the end of my talk, I will share you about the Bauhaus School. And we will see the evolution of Bauhaus School, and it changed the whole mindset of a design Western civilization thinking, especially in the European countries. So what makes design such a complicated activity? Jones like to say this on design methods. Design is complicated because we, like I said redundantly, we have to think about the past, the present, the future. So a good designer, he can predict what's going to happen next. Remember what Frank Lloyd Wright always say? If you want to become an architect, you have to think like a prophet. You have to think at least 20 years ahead if you want to become a good architect, because an architect is like a prophet. That's what Frank Lloyd Wright say. An architect is also same like a designer. So if you cannot think what's going to happen in the future, it's very hard for you to become a good designer. So because design is not only about product, it affects of what you want to achieve. Okay, some of you going to make money, profits. That is in terms of business, where you talk about competitive advantage. You know, we talk about IKEA. Last time, when you come up with a design of furniture, you talk about craftsmen, especially antiques furniture. It's only antiques by itself because it is not mass produced. But when IKEA comes into place, they talk about furniture in a very big mass production. So now everyone can own IKEA within their home ground, within their home living, because IKEA is cheap. You know what IKEA is? IKEA, right? Where they sell furniture. And we talk about mass production furniture. Everyone can own IKEA because IKEA is reasonable in terms of the pricing, in terms of the costing, and the design is beautiful and the design is functional. And this is what I say is that IKEA managed to do that because they believe in what users want. They believe in the pleasurable experiences of human comfort, of users' comfort. And this is what makes IKEA sustain. Okay, we will look into IKEA later and we'll talk about design in terms of IKEA and also IDEO. And another important thing is that we talk about society, the welfare of the people. And that's also make what IKEA and IDEO successful in that sense. Okay, so Jones always say that I say about this again and again, design is actually unintended consequences. You know, you have to think about the short term, the mid-term, and also the long term. So that's what makes it beautiful. And design ability is actually possessed by everyone. That's what's said by Nigel Cross. But if we look at possessing by everyone, not all of us have good design ability, you know, because we all of us architects, you know, all of us have design background. We can sketch, we can draw, but can we do something that is beyond the humanity thing, beyond the human needs and things like that? And that is really important. So we have to think the future ahead and what is the contribution that we can give back to society. And this is some examples of IKEA. I'll go more detail into this. Some examples of furniture, simple, functional, but it really works, you know, and IKEA does that marvelous kind of a job. And this is one of also IKEA product. For those of you who have small babies, okay, you need to take care of your babies, you need to give them food, and at the same time, they have to stay at the dinner table. So what IKEA did was that by Bajusta, they designed a dining table that has a hole in it where it carries babies. And this is very important for newly mothers who actually have twins or actually have babies. So while you actually stay with your family in the dining table, you actually at the same time can feed your babies. And this is the beauty part when I say about IKEA, because IKEA is not only thinking about designing furniture for beauty what you call that needs, which means that you're designing for aesthetical values or for beauty, for ornaments and things like that. But they also talk about the functional of daily lives, you know, talking about economy of how buying economy and things like that. And most of IKEA furniture is affordable to all of us, even though you are B40, you are come from the middle income or from the higher income group. And it stays with all family, modern family living nowadays. So I will go quickly on the design process because design process is a very theoretical, and I know basically all of you are designers, architects, but I will just run through quickly. So when we talk about design process, it always descriptive versus prescriptive. You know, descriptive meaning explaining on how things work and how as the action should be carried out. And that is in terms of perspective, prescriptive and perspective. And this is the most three important question when we're going to start design things. Why? Why are you going to do that? What if? What if your design works? What if your design don't work? And how your design going to contribute in the long run, in the short term, in the present context. So the question of why, what if, and how, this is actually the question that makes IDEO successful. Okay, IDEO is one of the company that starts about talking about designing products, not designers product, but products that fits in for all the common people. And I will go into that later. So when we talk about the why, the if, and the how, when we talk about the design process, it always has to relate with experiences, feeling, empathy, values. And these are very important because when you design a product without the feeling, the experience of the people, you will not design a good product. Okay, maybe you will design a designer's bag like Gucci, but it can only be owned by the certain few people. But we talk about how China become a mass production in terms of fulfilling all the needs of the people, you know, because China have these experiences of tackling in terms of what we call the bottom-up approach, you know, talking about the mass production from the basic society living. And it doesn't only tackle the high bourgeois or what we call orang bangsawan or the higher few people. And this is very important also in design, because when you talk about design, you talk about symbols, you talk about functional, practicality, useful, expression, it needs to have a certain values to it, attraction. And it also have to have this idea of perceived by the senses, which is the human senses, because the human touch will feel comfort if your product that you come out or your design is actually have a certain quality and standards to it. So basically, design process describe how you can work and how you must work. But what are the things that you should have in a design process, and what is a process? So when we talk about a process, it has to relate with a series of phases of actions and steps. And it has to start with analysis first. We are researchers. We've done a lot of research. But I would like to ask you, how many of our research product actually goes to the market, being a prototype that actually can sell as a product to actually fulfill the need of the community and the society? Not all of our research goes to the market. And most of our research that we did is actually keep it in a shelf, and nobody knows about our research. So this is what is very important, because when we want to come up with certain products and outcome, we need to have a good analysis. And from the analysis, we come to a synthesis, we come to evaluation. And I'm not going to talk deep into this because it's going to be very theoretical. This is some of the design process that I show you, like Koberg and Bagnall, talking about input, output, synthesis, analysis. Rosenberg talks about the process of function analysis, then until it comes to the end product. Foreman talks about how he develops into from the issue to the problem to the solution. And it comes out to the embodiment, to the detailed design, from the abstract to the concrete product. William Pena also talks about the schematic. All of these are process. And I think that if you are an architecture student, if you are a researcher, you apply this in your daily work activities. And it's nothing new. Okay, you're looking into paradigm, you're looking into investigation, you come up with a program brief, you come up with a proposal, and at the end of the day, you communicate your design to the user. So it is all the basic thing, the post-design, the design process, and the pre-design. And what Nigel Cross likes to say was that whenever you do designs, there's always this process of divergence and convergence. And I really like when Nigel Cross described this, because design is not only about getting to the end of the tunnel, you achieving what you want in the process of the outcome. But there's always external and internal factors that comes to the process when you go to the end solution. And this is when Nigel Cross talks about divergence, convergence, then it goes back to divergence, then it goes back to convergence again, because design is actually an iteration process. It is not a one way. And it's always iteration, that like a hermeneutic cycle, that it goes back again and again in that sense. And Richard Buchanan also talks about process and practices, where he talks about the rhetoric and the belief into design that adds into the idea of delivery and presentation. Talk about the idea of realization. And this is also important as part of design. And the one that I like to highlight today is about IDEO. Because IDEO is the most successful company that talks about product making to suit to all the needs of the common people and also the society. And in IDEO, they believe in these 5 steps, which is observation. You look at how and the daily life and activities of what does human needs. And you brainstorm the ideas and you come up with the rapid prototyping and you test the prototype that you produce, and then you refine it again, and then you come to the process of implementation. So if you look at the ideal way of thinking, it is the similar way of how our traditional vernacular houses are built. Remember my earlier slide, I talked about the comparison between traditional house and modern house, because traditional houses goes to the same process like IDEO. Because like what I'm saying, a traditional house was not built by an architect. Traditional vernacular houses was not built by a professional architect who get a structured education, a PhD, or an architect profession from a university. Traditional houses was built by craftsmen, and craftsmen goes to the same process like what IDEO implemented, by observation. If you look at how craftsmen comes up to a very unique design of what we know as ukiran or ornamentation, they learn from the masters. They learn from what we call the Tok Guru, by observation. And then they brainstorm, and then they produce a prototype, and then they refine it, and then they come to the implementation to the society. And that's what make traditional vernacular houses works up until now. In that sense, that is what I'm trying to give you the example of the IDEO design. And IDEO also look as the idea of framing a question. And this is very important. Framing a question, and you get the feedback from the society, you gather the inspiration, you generate the ideas, and you make the ideas tangible. And then after that, you test it with the society to refine the product in that sense. So I would like to give you a quick understanding what is IDEO. Maybe some of you haven't heard what is IDEO before. So IDEO is actually an international design founded in Palo Alto by David Kelly Design, and it was founded by Stanford University, known as David Kelly. And IDEO was now currently is a very mass kind of idea talking about design thinking and design process and design methodology, where they try to help in terms of consultation of company in terms of producing products, services, looking into the built environment, the tangible and the tangible kind of products, and also digital experiences. So IDEO is very active in terms of management and consulting of product making for the benefit of the society. And it is a very, very kind of a good consulting company in that sense. You can just Google IDEO and can see what they have done. And IDEO always looks into this idea of human-centered design. And this is what I gave you the early quotes by Tim Brown, who is the CEO of IDEO. He talks about the needs of the people. He talks about the possibilities of technology. He talks about the requirement of success. And when we talk about that, desirability makes viability, viability makes feasibility. And this idea of IDEO was actually implemented into IKEA, which is the mass production of furniture nowadays that is famous all around the world. Indonesia also have IKEA furniture, am I right? Malaysia is very popular in IKEA. So the idea of talking about human-centered design is actually what we need in terms of our designing thinking. And human-centered design looks back into the idea of divergent and convergent. And it also talks about the idea of inspiration and implementation in that kind of a process. And the idea of IDEO is actually not something new, because IDEO learns from the Bauhaus. I hope all the architecture students know what is Bauhaus, right? Bauhaus is a famous design school that was started in Weimar by Walter Gropius at the early part of the modernism era. Okay, and it was started in Germany by Walter Gropius. I will show you the video later on how does Bauhaus change the whole of thinking of designers the whole worldwide. So I will go just quickly, what is design thinking? Like what I say, like IDEO was saying, design thinking is a human-centered core. And the most important thing of design thinking, the word empathy. Empathy here means you design things, you must understand your user needs. There's no point of designing a product, there's no point of producing an architecture project which doesn't care about the people, which doesn't care about the environment. This is what I would like to say always to my students. Whenever you design a building, please think about society. Please think about human values. Please think about cultural values. Because when you design a building without sense of empathy, you are just designing an edifice. An edifice means a dead monument. You know what dead monument is? Bangunan mati. I would like to say there's a very nice song by Noah. Who's Noah? I think Indonesia is very famous with Noah. Peter Pan, Ariel. That's one song that he wrote, Kota Mati. It's a very nice song, Kota Mati, where the lyrics is very deep. It talks about a dead city people because there's no empathy into it. There's no feeling. There's no emotion. There's no what we call soul into it. Jiwa, yeah, jiwa. And this is important whenever you become a designer. And when we talk about the three essential pillars of design thinking, is also about ideation. Ideation doesn't come from one people alone, because we have to generate a lot of ideas, brainstorming, doing a bottom-up approach from the community up to the politician. Nowadays in Malaysia, it's a different things around. It's from politician to the society. And I think Indonesia is also the same, right? Because when the direction comes from the top management, from the politician, it goes down to the society. We built Kota Mati. We built an edifice. That's why when we look into our parks design, our urban parks design, our kindergarten design, our schools design, our shop houses design, we are not designing for the people. We are designing for the fews. We're designing for the politician. I'm just taking an example. When we have the biggest mosque in the world, I think Indonesia has Istiqlal Mosque, right? In Jakarta. Okay. It's so huge. Malaysia also have a lot of mosques. But the way how we design the mosque, it doesn't fulfill the need of the people. It only symbolizes the political ideology of the politician, but it does not symbolize the needs of the society, which is the Muslim society. Most of the mosques when we design is an empty building. It's only used for 5 prayers a day. After the 5 prayers, the mosque is locked. Nobody goes to the mosque. So the mosque becomes a monument. It is not a communal gathering mosque. Similar, if you see the days of the Prophet, it's just a small mosque, but Masjid Nabawi really works because it brings the community into it. So this is one of the examples I would like to say. And also experimentation, testing those ideas with prototype. Okay, I'm giving you an example of a sea swing. You know swing? Dipanggil dalam bahasa Melayu buai, ya? Buai. I'm not so sure in Indonesia what does it call. But if you see the first picture, this is the ideation of a swing by a project sponsor. But if you see the second picture, by the project request. If you see the next picture, by senior analyst, by programmer. And if you look at this picture beneath here, what does the user want? If you see at all of the design of the swing hanging at the tree, the user just want a simple swing. A swing that is tied up with a rope and with a rubber tire. This is what user want. So symbolically, what does it shows that you can design beautiful things, expensive things with all these ornaments, with all of these tactics, with all of these methods and approaches. But at the end, what the user want is just a simple swing. A swing that is hang on a rope, tied up to a piece of rubber tire. Because why? Because these swings sustain and fulfill the function forever. Kids love to use rubber tires as a swing. Why? Because it's comfort to sit. So this is what basically where we talk about the idealized process of thinking about design. It's not about what you want. It's about what the community wants. All right, I hope that's clear. So what's next? So how do we, architecture schools, I'm talking this because we are from architecture background, can apply a justified design process and thinking in the design projects? So I'm going to take you some few examples. This is one of the example that we have a conversation, UTM has a conversation with University of Sheffield, because one of our adjunct professors is from University of Sheffield. We talk about this idea of Odessa project. So Odessa project is talking about developing an elderly housing, but focusing into the aging of place. And what is the beauty part of this Odessa project is that they understand on how to design a place for the elderly. And the case study is actually located in China. And what I'm trying to showcase here is not the beauty part of the design, but looking into how this Odessa project handled the design process. And if you look into the Odessa project framework, is that they are not talking about building new buildings for elderly housing. They are talking about the concept of retrofitting. I hope all of you know what is retrofitting all about. Retrofitting means that you are creating something with existing things. And this aging into place is just talking about how you're going to retrofit this design within the house that you live in. So for that, these elderly, they don't have to move out to a different building, but they can age in place. So in this sense, the Odessa project framework is talking about the idea of retrofitting recommendation. So they look at the process of mobility, the sensory of the elderly, the cognitive, the health and safety, and also the social inclusion. And how do they come about is that they don't create something new. The process of the design is similar with the IDEO, is that they look into the focus group discussion through the exploratory technique approach of design process. So they call in a huge number of elderly people sitting within the same room, sitting within the same round table, and they ask the elderly people, what do they want? So these elderly people then come up with these ideas of what are the spaces that they want in terms of mobility, in terms of sensory, in terms of cognitive, and in terms of social inclusion. And if you look at my left-hand side, right-hand side, is actually a sketch. And these elderly people, they are not architects. They are just simple layman people. And they sketch what do they want for their home. They want to have a balcony, they want to have a dining room, they want to have a healthcare, they want to have a medical within the same space. And from this, just a simple sketch, and all these sketches are being collected, and then after that, it's being reviewed and it's being analyzed. Remember the ideal steps that I showed you earlier, the 5 steps, is that you're refining and getting the feedbacks from the user. And all of these are done inclusively and using this bottom-up approach. And then after that, they refine continuous improvement, and then they come up to an adaptability. So what the beauty part of it was that they get the empathy values directly from the elderly. And from that sense, they built scenarios. And this is very, very important, where they map out the scenarios, what does really the elderly people want. So when they map up the scenarios, they come up with a mapping. And these scenarios is very unique because it actually showcases what does the 60-year-old couple want who want to age in place. What does an 80-year-old people want when they want to age in place? And they come up with this diagram. And this Odessa project is that they map all of these different scenarios, different way of living, different background, different gender of these elderly people, and they built up this huge data. And so from this huge data finding, they produce the design layout of the apartment. It just look like a simple apartment, a common apartment. It may be the same apartment you have in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in China, in modern cities. But the beauty part of this apartment was that it was built based on the empathy values and what does the elderly people want. And it is very, very detailed in that sense. So if you look at the design of the living room for the elderly housing, every part is integrated with technology. Every nook and corner. So for instance, number 1, you have a telephone. The telephone is placed within the reach of the elderly people. How they design the digital smart television. How they place the illuminated switches. So all of these in terms of the dimension, in terms of the anthropometrics, in terms of the facilities are all designed based on the mapping scenarios that they get from the elderly. And this is what we want when we do designs, especially for students. We cannot imagine things, what do they want? We have to ask them firsthand. And if you look at the bathroom, it's a simple bathroom. But this bathroom is retrofit within the modern living bathroom that they have, but the design is all fixtures and fittings according to the elderly needs. Like you have a shower, like you have a place to sit, adjustable toilet bowl, adjustable height shower. So this is all common within the design of the toilet. So if you buy, like say, a modern house, do you have this fitting in your house? No, because when you go elderly, you actually have to renovate everything, the bathroom, the living room, the dining room, and things like that. Because if you're an elderly, you have to go by wheelchair. But if all of these are retrofit firsthand, when you purchase the house earlier, it will be much easier for your later retired life. The kitchen and how they place, the stove, how they put the sink, how they place the windows, adjustable height, and things like that. So this is the beauty part when we talk about bottom-up approach. And Odessa is actually a framework where actually Sheffield University is working with China University and with the EU University to produce this kind of a design prototype model that can be applied to all of newly built apartments throughout the developed countries. All around the world. And I think Odessa project is a very good project because the way how they frame the methodology and approach is good in that sense. And example of the bedroom also for the elderly, talking about the idea of retrofitting. So I would like to end my talk today, and I hope that my talk inspires you as a new generation and inspires you as a researcher and inspires you to become a good designer. And to end, I would like to go to the Bauhaus School, because Bauhaus School is actually the beginning that talks about creativity in design, that also talks about the earlier thinking that applied the concept of IDEO, which IDEO that is applied in IKEA, which is IKEA become the, what you call that, the mass acceptable furniture standards all around the world nowadays. And if I just going to give you a very quickly understanding for those who do not know what is Bauhaus. So Bauhaus is actually founded by an architect known as Walter Gropius in Weimar. It was in the late 19th century. And the Bauhaus style actually influenced how modernists think in terms of architecture, in terms of new architecture education, and the most important thing is in terms of arts and design and how design can contribute to society. And the most important thing is that Bauhaus School also produced a lot of famous designers and architects. And one of it is Paul Klee, we have Marcel Brauner, we have Gunther Stoltz, and all of these people make name in our prominent history, especially in architecture and also in the design aspect. And before I end with a video, I would like to say the quote by Walter Gropius: "Art and the people must form an entity. The aim is an alliance of the arts under the wing of a great architecture." So what does it mean here is that art and the people need to be combined together, and design is the soul for everything. So Steve Jobs, you know who Steve Jobs is? The famous Apple people talking about iPhone, right? Design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works. So architecture student, whenever you produce a building, make sure your building works. And CEO of Jaguar, Dr. Ralph Speth, he talks about, if you think good design is expensive, you should look at the cost of bad design. Bad design stays forever. And if you design badly, the future will have to suffer the consequences. And YC Sun, the director of IDEO, talks about you have to treat the product that you produce as exploratory. When you build the future, what is a question you want to learn about your product and who you're building for? And the word who here is important. You need to understand the values of empathy, because you don't design for designers. You don't design for the few. You don't design for the few politicians or for the bourgeois. You design for the people. Right? Okay, good. So with that, I would like to end myself. Thank you so much. But I hope that Ibu Andi can play the Bauhaus video for 30 minutes so all of you can understand what is Bauhaus all about. So with that, thank you so much. And I hope to see all of you soon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. I will continue your movie, Bu Alice.
Yep, thank you.
Wait, Bu Alice. Wait, Bu Alice, ya.
Estetika.
Serial production of everyday goods was a cornerstone of the Bauhaus vision, a partnership between design and industry. At the furniture retailer IKEA, that vision seems to have become reality. Eva Maria Runegard knows exactly what consumers want.
How can you have your first home and your first bed, your first sofa, your first desk actually accessible at a price that you can afford?
Affordability is the linchpin of the company's business model. IKEA was founded in 1943. Generations have grown up with its designs. So is IKEA the Bauhaus of today? Is it exactly what Bauhaus founder Walter Gropius envisaged a century ago?
We have a tool that we call democratic designs, and that tool has 5 dimensions, starting with form. A connection to Bauhaus, as we are talking about today, is of course that form follows function, needs to be at a good quality for what it's the intended use. We work very heavily with sustainability, and we take all of those 4 together with a low price. That's when you have a typical IKEA product.
The 5 pillars of democratic design, as formulated by IKEA founder Ingvar Kamprad. He wanted everyone to be able to afford well-made products. So did Walter Gropius, the first Bauhaus director. In Weimar, he proposed that art, craft, and industry collaborate to make consumer products more available to the common man. Weimar was a conservative place, and the Bauhaus school was eventually forced to move. It relocated to Dessau, which proved a far better fit.
Weimar didn't want the Bauhaus, and in 1925, Gropius had to look for an alternative site. Dessau seemed to be the best option. There were plenty of opportunities for the school to flourish there. Politics and industry had vested interests in the Bauhaus moving to Dessau. At the time, the region was similar to Silicon Valley today, if you will.
In Dessau, the school joined forces with a number of industrial partners. Inspired by series production, the Bauhaus began exploring synergies between art and technology.
In
total, Bauhaus partnered here in Dessau with thousands of firms to work on various projects, both large and small. There were very close ties between the school and industry. Lots of people commissioned the Bauhausers to design fittings for their homes, to design brochures for their companies. But of course, there were plenty of raised eyebrows too. And eventually, they had to move on once again.
Against the backdrop of the Great Depression, the liberal Bauhaus school came under increasing pressure. In 1928, tired of facing constant hostility, director Walter Gropius appointed a successor. With Swiss architect Hannes Meyer at the helm, the Bauhaus focused even more heavily on industry and also became more political.
Hannes Meyer moved the Bauhaus in a very socialist direction, communist even. In the extremely productive 2 years that he was director, this played a major role, which was very different from the Gropius era.
The Bauhaus set out to design and manufacture well-made products for everyone. Catering to everyday needs took priority over artistic considerations.
They wanted to reach households, homes, society in general, and with products that looked completely unlike anything that had existed before. There was a turning point after the First World War.
By 1922 or 1923 at the latest, everyone was excited about mechanization and industrial production.
Der Nachkriegszeit.
There was a consensus that in the post-war era, people should be modern and welcome technology and progress. And this should be reflected in everyday products, from carpets to houses to the urban environment. And they were to do this so as to modernize the city and indeed the world. IKEA's ultimate goal is no different. Just like the Bauhaus, the retailer sees itself as a kind of laboratory for a better everyday life.
We want to create a better everyday life for the many people, which in one way as a philosophy is very similar to the thinking of Bauhaus, that design should not be for the few. Good products should be for the many.
For IKEA, the many are first and foremost consumers. Ultimately, it wants to sell products. The Bauhaus effect is unmistakable. IKEA's democratic design is by definition mass-produced. The retailer has adapted the core Bauhaus philosophy to today's consumer society. Hannes Meyer was the Bauhaus director for just 2 years. In 1930, the town council dismissed him for communist sympathies. Along with some former students, he went to the Soviet Union to help build the fledgling state. The Second World War tore Germany into two. Weimar and Dessau ended up in communist East Germany.
Das Bauhaus hatte ohnehin in den frühen
There was no scope for Bauhaus to be revived in the early years of communist East Germany. It was rejected as a bourgeois institution.
Als eine bourgeoise Einrichtung. Das dauerte.
That was the attitude until well after the death of Stalin. Basically until the early 1960s and the rise of architectural functionalism, when urban planners began erecting prefab houses in estates on the outskirts of cities. At that point, Bauhaus was reevaluated and once again seen as a good thing. Hannes Meyer's legacy was politicized design and the famous slogan Volksbedarf statt Luxusbedarf, the needs of the people instead of the need for luxury. Today, Bauhaus designed products are expensive. Only the well-off can afford them, such as Wilhelm Wagenfeld's table lamp. It's now a classic. The Wagenfeld table lamp costs around 400 euros. That's because it was designed and manufactured at the Bauhaus School before serial production had really taken off. Even at the time, the Wagenfeld lamp was so expensive that it didn't sell very well.
Dass man große Schwierigkeiten hatte, es überhaupt verkaufen zu können.
Without series production, the Wagenfeld lamp could only remain a luxury item. But the lamp did cross the Atlantic. The Museum of Modern Art in New York City has one in its collection. In the late 1920s, MoMA's founding director Alfred Barr helped introduce Americans to the Bauhaus. Swiss-born Martino Stierli is MoMA's chief curator of architecture and design.
Alfred Barr hat sich schon sehr from very early on. Alfred Barr was keen on Bauhaus and the European avant-garde in general. What he especially liked about Bauhaus was its push to incorporate art into everyday life. Also, its merging of art and technology and its interdisciplinary approach, and its aim of making the arts non-hierarchical. Alfred Barr took these principles, these basic Bauhaus concepts, and worked them into the founding structure of the Museum of Modern Art. Direkt einfließen lassen.
Thus, Bauhaus serves as the foundation of one of the world's foremost art collections.
Bauhaus stands for a very particular aesthetic, but at the same time, The Bauhaus is quite a vague term. Anything that counts as modernist design in the broadest sense very quickly finds itself being described as Bauhaus in a rather reductive fashion. It's also a way of signaling your own stylistic preferences. Perhaps that's problematic, but of course it's also symptomatic of an extraordinary success. If you become a brand, you've really made it.
Well, the Bauhaus is like a virus. So it spreads more quickly than you realize. What if nothing interesting ever happened at the Bauhaus, but they had an amazing publicity machinery, books, magazines, personalities. But was this all just kind of creating a kind of cult? So maybe Bauhaus is not about rationality, it's not about industrialization, it's not about clarity in the machine age and so on. Gropius, he's a hardcore expressionist at the beginning of Bauhaus moments. He becomes a kind of a manager. Is it management culture that spread? We are surrounded here by the effects of this virus, and we are in the center of management culture. This is New York Management Central.
Architecture critic Mark Wigley lives in New York, but finds the glass and steel oppressive. Has the name Bauhaus simply become a catch-all label, devoid of real substance? Bauhaus is now a brand, instantly recognizable. Perhaps that's why it's such an enduring favorite, especially for connoisseurs of design and architecture, like the Ellers.
You'd think it was newly built. People are always asking us about it. We stumbled across the house completely by chance. It was advertised in a Wiesbaden bank as a bungalow in need of renovation in a prime location. And I said to my wife, that sounds interesting. Let's take a look.
What the Ellers found was a piece of architectural history. Not even the estate agent was aware that the bungalow was the last surviving house in Germany designed by Bauhaus architect Marcel Breuer.
We sensed immediately that there was something special about it. It hadn't been touched in years, and honestly, it was in terrible condition. But somehow, you could still sense the spirit of Breuer. Breuer positioned the eaves and the ledges under the windows so that sunlight refracts below the windows and there's never any direct sunlight in the rooms. He left nothing to chance. Everything has been meticulously thought through. It's absolutely fascinating. You can't help but be seduced. You have to give it to him. Hats off, respect. These days, you don't see many elements like these in houses anymore. The cubist look has become very popular again. There's lots of new houses and they're very nice. But back then, they put a lot more thought into what it would actually be like to live in these houses.
Usually, architects take cues from their clients, but here the owners took their cues from Bauhaus-inspired furnishings. In the late 1920s, Marcel Breuer designed this chair for the Tornet Company. The marriage of art and industry had become reality.
These are matching items of garden furniture. They're not only comfortable, they also look amazing. Lots of tubular steel, very light, white, very sleek.
The couple had previously only been familiar with Breuer, the furniture designer, but now they've inadvertently become guardians of his architectural legacy.
Wir waren in Berlin, in Weimar, in Dessau. We went to Berlin, to Weimar and Dessau and really studied the Bauhaus philosophy. We learned a lot. We felt it was important we understood more about it if we were going to live in this house.
What immediately strikes you is that the functional rooms face north, and the rooms you actually spend time in face south. So the house has a very positive energy.
Of course, not everyone has their own private Bauhaus museum, but they can always make a pilgrimage to the Vitra Design Museum in Weil am Rhein. Herzog and de Meuron, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, and many other contemporary architects have left their mark here. For museum director Matteo Kries, architecture and design are central to the human experience.
Design ist eigentlich eine Herangehensweise an.
Design is basically a way of solving a problem, an opportunity to tackle everyday problems with creative ideas. That can involve furniture, but it can also involve processes and social situations. There's much more to design than making products.
Mehr ist als nur Objektgestaltung. Designer befassen sich auch.
Designers also address questions to do with society, new materials, and with things that are not always tangible.
Und dieses
That's an understanding of design that has its roots in Bauhaus.
Das Bauhaus war
The school was one of the first institutions propagating a wide-ranging understanding of design that went beyond individual objects. Through the Bauhaus, design was a way of shaping society and the future.
Zukunft verstanden.
The museum's collection has some 7,000 exhibits, including many iconic examples of international product design. There are famous pieces by Marcel Breuer.
Well, Lisa, the room is yours.
Alright, terima kasih ya Ibu. Thank you so much Ibu for sharing the video. It's a very long video. It's supposed to be 30 minutes. So we just only played until about 10 minutes to 15 minutes. But if you want to know the rest of the Bauhaus video, you can access it from Ibu Andi. So should I give back to the moderator, Ibu Andi, or should I just continue with the question and answer session? Bagaimana ya? Terus ya kepada soal jawab jika ada soalan.
Narisa?
Yeah. Thank you,